First story, A Desert Highway's Alien Secret. Chile, 2007. It was just another night on Highway 9, or at least that's what I thought when I started my usual route. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years now, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on these lonely Chilean roads. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that night. The air was crisp, and the stars were shining bright in the clear sky. I remember thinking how beautiful it all looked, how peaceful. Man, if I only knew what was coming. I had my thermos of coffee next to me, some old rock tunes playing on the radio, and the familiar hum of my truck's engine keeping me company. Everything seemed normal, you know. Just another long haul through the night. But as I drove further north, I started to notice something odd. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me after hours of staring at the dark road. But no matter how many times I blinked or shook my head, it was still there. A strange light in the distance, always staying just ahead of me. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who jumps to conclusions. My first thought was that it must be another vehicle, maybe someone with their high beams on or something. But as I kept driving, things just didn't add up. This light, it was too bright, too steady. It didn't bounce or flicker like normal headlights would on this bumpy road. And the weirdest part, no matter how fast I drove or how the road curved, that light stayed perfectly in front of me, always at the same distance. It was like it was taunting me, you know? I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably just some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, or maybe lights from a town in the distance. But deep down, I knew this was something different, something unnatural. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt this creeping sense of dread building in my gut. I've never been one to scare easy, but something about this situation had me on edge. After about an hour of this cat-and-mouse game with the mysterious light, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to stop and figure out what the hell was going on. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I cut the engine, an eerie silence fell over everything. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just dead silence. And that's when I saw it. As soon as I stepped out of my truck, I looked up and nearly fell backwards. Hovering above me, silent as death, was something. I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't like any aircraft I've ever seen. It was massive, easily the size of a football field, with a metallic surface that seemed to shimmer and change colors in the moonlight. The thing that struck me most was how it made absolutely no sound. You'd expect something that big to make some kind of noise, right? But there was nothing. Just this oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me from all sides. I tried to move, to run back to my truck, to do anything, but I couldn't. It was like my entire body was frozen in place. I could feel my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps, but I couldn't move a muscle. And then the feeling hit me. This overwhelming sense that I was being watched, studied, analyzed. It wasn't just a feeling of being observed. It was like every cell in my body was being scanned and catalogued. The pressure in my head was intense, like it was going to explode. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound would come out. I was trapped there, a prisoner in my own body, as this thing loomed over me. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed under that impossible craft. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The only thing I was aware of was the intense pressure in my head and this bizarre sensation of being pulled apart and put back together, over and over again. It was like every atom in my body was being examined and rearranged. I could feel something probing my mind, sifting through my memories, my thoughts, my fears. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was deeply unsettling. Like having someone rifle through your most private possessions while you're powerless to stop them. I tried to resist, to push back against this invasion, but it was useless. Whatever was happening, I was completely at its mercy. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the craft was gone. One moment it was there, filling my entire field of vision, and the next, nothing. Just the empty night sky and the stars, twinkling as if nothing had happened. The moment the ship disappeared, I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air like I'd been underwater for hours. My whole body was shaking uncontrollably, and I was drenched in cold sweat. I lay there on the hard asphalt, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real? Or had I somehow fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing? But no, the dirt on my clothes and the scrapes on my hands from falling were very real. As I slowly regained control of my body, I became aware of how utterly exhausted I felt. It was like I'd run a marathon or gone 10 rounds in a boxing ring. Every muscle ached, and my head was pounding with the worst migraine of my life. I managed to drag myself back to my feet, using the truck for support. That's when I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The sky was starting to lighten, dawn was breaking, but that was impossible. When I'd stopped, it had been just past midnight. There was no way enough time had passed for the sun to be coming up. With shaking hands, I climbed back into my truck and checked the clock on the dashboard. 5:47 a.m. I stared at those glowing numbers, trying to make them make sense. I'd lost nearly 6 hours, 6 hours that I couldn't account for. I grabbed my logbook, desperate for some kind of explanation, some evidence of what I'd been doing during that lost time. But the pages were blank. According to my logs, I should have been hundreds of kilometers back down the road. I fumbled for my phone, thinking maybe I'd called someone, left a message, anything. But there were no outgoing calls, no texts, nothing to explain where I'd been or what I'd been doing for 6 hours. As the reality of the situation started to sink in, I felt a wave of nausea hit me. I barely made it out of the truck before I was violently sick on the side of the road. As I stood there, bent over and retching, I became aware of a strange marking on my wrist. It looked almost like a barcode, but with symbols I didn't recognize. When I touched it, my skin tingled and the image seemed to shift and change. I rubbed at it frantically, trying to wipe it off, but it was like it was etched into my skin. I don't know how long I sat there in my truck, staring at that weird mark on my wrist and trying to piece together what had happened. My mind was racing, jumping from one terrifying possibility to another. Had I been abducted, experimented on? The thought made me sick all over again. I tried to focus, to remember anything from those missing hours, but it was like trying to grab smoke. Every time I thought I had a hold on a memory, it would slip away, leaving me with nothing but a vague sense of unease. Eventually, I knew I had to get moving. I couldn't just sit there forever, and I had a job to do, but as I started up the truck and pulled back onto the highway, nothing felt the same. The familiar road now seemed alien and threatening. Every shadow, every glint of light in my mirrors made me flinch. I kept expecting to see that strange craft again, looming over me. The worst part was the feeling that I wasn't alone in my own head anymore. It was like something had been left behind, some presence that was watching my every thought. As I drove, I started noticing other things that were off. My body felt different, like it didn't quite fit me anymore. My joints ached in ways they never had before, and I swear my vision was sharper, colors more vivid. At one point, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror and nearly swerved off the road. For a split second, I could have sworn my eyes were completely black, like empty sockets. I blinked, and they were back to normal, but the image haunted me for the rest of the drive. I tried to distract myself by turning on the radio, but every station was nothing but static. Even my collection of old cassettes just produced a weird, high-pitched whine when I tried to play them. It was like the whole world had shifted slightly, and nothing quite worked the way it was supposed to anymore. I've never felt so alone and isolated in my life, even though I was on a major highway. It was like I was the last person left in the world, or maybe like I didn't quite belong in this world anymore. I finally made it to my destination, hours late and in a state of near panic. My boss was furious, demanding to know where I'd been and why I hadn't called in. I opened my mouth to explain, but what could I say? That I'd been abducted by aliens. That I'd lost 6 hours of my life to some impossible encounter on a deserted highway. I mumbled some excuse about truck trouble and feeling sick, but I could tell he didn't buy it. As he chewed me out, I barely heard a word he was saying. All I could focus on was the strange buzzing in my ears and the constant, nagging feeling that I was being watched. When he finally finished yelling and stormed off, I slumped against my truck, exhausted and overwhelmed. That's when I noticed something else weird. The cargo I was supposed to be delivering. It was different, not completely. Most of it was what I remembered loading back at the depot. But there were boxes I didn't recognize, with labels in a language I couldn't read. When I touched one of these strange boxes, a jolt of electricity seemed to shoot up my arm, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard voices in my head, speaking in that same unknown language. The next few days were a blur of confusion and mounting terror. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that night, strange symbols, glimpses of beings that couldn't possibly exist, sensations of floating and falling. When I did manage to drift off, I'd wake up screaming, my bed soaked with sweat. Food tasted like ash in my mouth, and I couldn't shake this constant feeling of being contaminated somehow. I tried to talk to my wife about what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. It was like there was a barrier in my mind, preventing me from fully articulating the experience. And the more I tried to push against it, the worse the headaches got. These weren't normal headaches. It felt like my skull was being squeezed in a vice, pressure building until I thought my head would explode. Sometimes in the midst of these episodes, I'd hear that strange language again. Whispers, just on the edge of comprehension. Things at work went from bad to worse. I couldn't focus, couldn't remember simple routes I'd driven 100 times before. More than once, I found myself on unfamiliar roads, with no recollection of how I'd gotten there. The GPS on my phone would glitch out, showing impossible locations or just a blank screen. My coworkers started avoiding me, shooting me worried glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I caught snippets of their conversations, words like unstable and breakdown that made my stomach churn. But how could I explain to them what was happening when I didn't understand it myself? The strange mark on my wrist seemed to be spreading, thin lines branching out like a circuit board under my skin. I took to wearing long sleeves, even in the sweltering heat, terrified someone would see it and ask questions I couldn't answer. At night, those lines would glow faintly, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Sometimes I'd wake up to find myself standing at the window, staring up at the sky, with no memory of getting out of bed. About a week after the incident, things took an even stranger turn. I started noticing discrepancies in the world around me. Small things at first. Street signs with names I didn't recognize. Buildings that seemed to have sprung up overnight. But it got worse. One day I came home to find my house had changed color. My wife insisted it had always been blue, but I knew it had been white just that morning. She looked at me like I was crazy when I tried to argue. Her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and fear that made my heart ache. That night, as we lay in bed, I could have sworn her face looked different, subtly altered in ways I couldn't quite pin down. I lay there for hours, staring at her sleeping form, trying to reconcile the woman beside me with the memory of the woman I'd married. Was I losing my mind? Or had something fundamental changed in the fabric of reality itself? The questions swirled in my head, keeping sleep at bay until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. As the days wore on, my grip on reality became increasingly tenuous. The world around me seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. Familiar faces would suddenly seem alien, as if someone had replaced my friends and family with nearly perfect copies. I'd catch glimpses of impossible things out of the corner of my eye, shadows that moved against the light, objects that seemed to phase in and out of existence. But the moment I tried to focus on them, they'd vanish, leaving me questioning whether I'd seen anything at all. The worst part was the dreams. Every night, I found myself back on that highway, reliving the encounter. But in these dreams, I could remember everything. I saw the inside of that craft, all sleek metal and pulsing lights. I felt the cold touch of something as it examined me, probed my mind, my body, my very essence. I woke from these nightmares, drenched in sweat, my throat raw from screaming, the taste of metal in my mouth. About 2 weeks after the incident, things came to a head. I was driving my usual route, trying to ignore the way the road seemed to twist and warp ahead of me, when I saw it again. That same light, hovering just ahead in the distance. Panic gripped me, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt in the middle of the highway. As I sat there, frozen in terror, the light grew brighter, expanding until it filled my entire field of vision. The pressure in my head built to an unbearable level, and I felt that same sensation of being pulled apart and put back together. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. I could see the patterns underlying reality, the interconnectedness of all things. Information flooded my mind, secrets of the universe, knowledge that no human was meant to possess. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never be the same again. And then, just like before, it was over. The light vanished, leaving me alone on the dark highway, but this time something was different. The crushing weight of confusion and fear that had been my constant companion since that first night was gone. In its place was a strange sense of calm, of purpose. I understood now why I had been chosen, what I needed to do. The mark on my wrist no longer frightened me. I recognized it as the gift it was, a key to unlock the mysteries of the universe. As I started the truck and continued my journey, I knew that my old life was over. I couldn't go back to my family, my job, my normal existence. They wouldn't understand, couldn't comprehend the transformation I had undergone. Instead, I drove on into the night, guided by a new sense of direction, a new mission. I don't know where this path will lead me or what I'll find at the end of it. But I do know that the world is far stranger, far more vast and terrifying and wonderful than I ever imagined. And somewhere out there beyond the stars, something is waiting for me. Something that will change everything for all of us. I just hope we're ready for it when it comes. Second story, a close encounter on National Highway 10, Mexico, 2006. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but I can't keep it bottled up anymore. It's been eating away at me for years, and I need to get it off my chest. My name's Jose, and I've been a truck driver for over 2 decades. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on National Highway 10 in northern Mexico. It was 2006, and I was doing my usual route, hauling goods from Chihuahua to Monterrey. The night was clear, stars twinkling above like they always do in the desert. I'd made this trip hundreds of times before, so I was on autopilot, my mind wandering as the miles rolled by. The radio was playing some old rancheras, and I was tapping, my fingers on the steering wheel, just another boring night on the job. But then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I noticed a bright light in the sky, way brighter than any star or plane I'd ever seen. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a really bright star or a helicopter, but as I kept driving, I realized something wasn't right. The light was moving, and not in any normal way. It was darting around, changing direction, in ways that defied physics. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was just tired and seeing things, but when I opened my eyes it was still there and it was getting closer. My heart started racing as I realized this thing, whatever it was, seemed to be following me. I glanced in my rearview mirror and there it was, this blindingly bright orb of light, keeping pace with my truck. I started to panic a little, my palms getting sweaty on the steering wheel. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of military test, or a new type of aircraft, but deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. I slowed down, hoping to get a better look at it. That's when things got really freaky. As I decelerated, this object, I guess you'd call it, started descending. It was like it was reacting to my actions, mimicking my speed. Before I knew it, it was hovering right above my truck. The light was so intense I could barely see the road anymore. It bathed everything in this eerie, otherworldly glow. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and a chill ran down my spine despite the warm night air. I wanted to stop, to get out and run, but I was paralyzed with fear. All I could do was keep driving, my eyes darting between the road and this impossible thing above me. Suddenly, without warning, my truck just died. The engine cut out, the lights went dark, even the radio stopped. I was coasting down the highway in total silence, surrounded by this unearthly light. I tried to restart the engine, but nothing happened. The steering wheel locked up and I lost all control. It was like the truck had a mind of its own, slowly coming to a stop in the middle of the empty highway. That's when I felt it, this overwhelming pressure on my chest, like something was pushing down on me. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was intense and terrifying. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely even breathe. And all the while, I had this bone-deep feeling that I was being watched, studied, like a bug under a microscope. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in my seat, with that light bearing down on me. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning. I remember trying to scream, but no sound came out. My mind was racing, filled with images of all the alien abduction stories I'd heard over the years. I'd always laughed them off before, but now, experiencing this, I knew with absolute certainty that they were real. And I was living through one. I don't know exactly when it ended. One moment, I was trapped in that otherworldly light, feeling like my very soul was being examined. The next, it was gone. Just gone. Like someone had flipped a switch. The oppressive feeling on my chest vanished, and I could move again. I gasped for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The highway was dark and silent. No sign of the strange light or whatever had been controlling it. My hands were shaking as I tried to restart the truck. To my surprise, it roared to life immediately, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Was I going crazy? Had I fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing? But no, it had felt too real, too vivid to be a dream. I looked at my watch, thinking only a few minutes had passed. That's when I realized with a jolt of horror that over an hour had disappeared. An entire hour of my life just gone. I couldn't account for it, couldn't remember anything after that light appeared above my truck. I drove the rest of the way to Monterey in a daze, my mind reeling. Every shadow on the road made me flinch. Every glint of starlight had me checking the sky frantically. When I finally reached my destination, I was a wreck. My colleagues noticed something was off, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that light, felt that pressure on my chest. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. What was that light? Why did it choose me? What happened during that missing hour? The next day I checked the truck's tachograph, hoping it might give me some answers, but it only confirmed my worst fears. There was a gap in the recording, matching exactly with the time I couldn't remember. It was like that hour had been erased, not just from my memory, but from reality itself. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to go back to my normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every time I got behind the wheel, I felt a surge of panic. The open road, which had always been my home, now felt alien and threatening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that at any moment, that light might reappear. I started taking different routes, avoiding National Highway 10 altogether. But it didn't help. The fear followed me everywhere. I couldn't sleep without nightmares, couldn't concentrate on anything. My work started to suffer, and my relationships too. How could I explain to my family, my friends, what I was going through? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, sometimes I thought I was crazy. I started researching UFO sightings, alien abductions, anything that might help me understand what had happened to me. I found stories similar to mine. People who had experienced lost time, strange lights, feelings of being examined. It was both comforting and terrifying to know I wasn't alone. But it also made me realize that there was something out there, something beyond our understanding, and it had taken an interest in me for some reason. As the months passed, my fear evolved into a kind of constant low-grade anxiety that colored every aspect of my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow changed. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but I felt different on a fundamental level. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at my hands, half expecting them to look different or do something strange. I became hyper-aware of my body, constantly checking for any unusual marks or sensations. Every unexplained bruise or odd ache sent my mind spiraling, wondering if it was somehow connected to that night on the highway. I started having these intense, vivid dreams that felt more like memories. Flashes of sterile white rooms. The sensation of cold metal against my skin. Shadowy figures moving around me, their features blurred and indistinct. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, unsure if what I'd seen was real or just my imagination running wild. These dreams left me more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed, and I found myself dreading sleep. The worst part was the constant feeling of being watched. It didn't matter where I was, driving my truck, at home with my family, or just walking down the street. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me. I'd find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the sky for any unusual lights. My family started to notice my behavior changing. My wife would catch me staring out the window for hours, lost in thought. My kids complained that I was always distracted, never really present even when I was home. I knew I was pushing them away, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap. How could I explain what I was going through without sounding completely insane? I started withdrawing from friends and co-workers too. Social situations became unbearable. I was constantly on edge, worried that at any moment I might see something or feel something that would trigger a panic attack. I couldn't relax, couldn't let my guard down. It was exhausting, living like this, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. About 6 months after the incident, something happened that shook me to my core. I was on a rare night out with some buddies from work, trying to act normal and forget about my troubles for a while. We were at a local bar having a few beers when I excused myself to use the restroom. As I was washing my hands, I glanced up at the mirror and froze. For a split second, just a fraction of a moment, I swear I saw something else looking back at me. It wasn't my face, but something alien, with huge dark eyes and grayish skin. I blinked, and it was gone. My own terrified face staring back at me. I stumbled out of the bathroom in a panic, mumbling some excuse to my friends before rushing home. That night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I finally admitted to myself that whatever had happened that night on the highway wasn't over. It was still affecting me, still changing me in ways I couldn't understand or control. I realized I needed help, but I had no idea where to turn. Who could I possibly talk to about this? What kind of help could there be for someone who'd experienced something so far beyond the realm of normal human experience? In desperation, I started searching online for support groups or communities for people who'd had similar experiences. It took some digging, but I eventually found a forum where people shared their stories of UFO encounters and alien abductions. At first, I was just a lurker, reading other people's accounts and feeling a mix of relief and terror at how similar some of them were to my own experience. It took me weeks to work up the courage to share my own story. When I finally did, the IUA response was overwhelming. People reached out with support, sharing their own experiences and offering advice on how to cope. For the first time since that night on the highway, I didn't feel so alone. Through this community, I learned about grounding techniques and meditation practices that helped me manage my anxiety. I started keeping a detailed journal of my dreams and any unusual experiences, hoping to find patterns or clues that might help me understand what had happened to me. It wasn't a cure, but it gave me a sense of control, a way to actively engage with my experience instead of just being a passive victim to it. As I delved deeper into the world of UFO research and alien encounters, I stumbled upon theories that both fascinated and terrified me. Some researchers believed that alien abductions were part of a long-term genetic experiment, that the beings were studying and possibly altering human DNA. Others suggested that the experiences were interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial, that these beings were slipping through cracks in reality rather than traveling across space. I don't know if any of these theories are true, but they gave me a framework to try and understand my experience. I started paying more attention to my body, wondering if there were subtle changes I hadn't noticed. I became obsessed with the idea of implants, convinced that the aliens must have left something inside me. I even went so far as to have full-body scans done, telling the doctors I was worried about cancer. They didn't find anything unusual, but that almost made it worse. If there were changes, they were beyond our ability to detect. About a year after the incident, something happened that made me question everything all over again. I was driving my usual route, forcing myself to face my fears and take Highway 10 again. It was a clear night, much like the one when it all started. Suddenly, my radio started acting up, crackling with static. My heart leapt into my throat as I saw a familiar glow on the horizon. But this time something was different. Instead of feeling afraid, I felt an overwhelming sense of anticipation. It was like some part of me had been waiting for this moment. The light grew closer, and I found myself pulling over to the side of the road. My hands were steady as I turned off the engine and stepped out of the truck. The light hovered above me, bathing everything in that otherworldly glow. But this time I wasn't paralyzed. I stood there, looking up at it, and felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. And then, as clearly as if someone was standing right next to me, I heard a voice in my head. "It's time," it said. "You're ready now." What happened next is still a blur in my mind. I have flashes of memory, walking towards the light, feeling weightless, a sense of movement without actually moving. When I came to, I was back in my truck, the sun peeking over the horizon. My watch showed that nearly 8 hours had passed, but it felt like only minutes. This time, though, the experience left me feeling different. Not scared or anxious, but almost enlightened. It's hard to explain, but it was like a fog had lifted from my mind. I felt more aware, more in tune with everything around me. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer. I could sense things I'd never noticed before. The energy of the earth beneath my feet, the subtle vibrations in the air. It was overwhelming at first, like my senses had been dialed up to 11. But as the days passed, I started to adjust to this new way of perceiving the world. I began to wonder if this is what had been happening all along, if that first encounter had been the start of some kind of transformation, and this second one had completed it. In the weeks that followed, I noticed other changes too. My reflexes were sharper, my mind clearer. I found I could remember things with incredible detail, recalling conversations word for word from years ago. I started having vivid dreams that felt more like visions, glimpses of places I'd never seen, technologies beyond anything on Earth. Sometimes, I'd wake up with complex equations or diagrams in my head, ideas for inventions that I couldn't possibly have come up with on my own. I started writing everything down, filling notebook after notebook with these strange insights. Part of me wondered if I was losing my mind, if all of this was just some elaborate delusion my brain had concocted to cope with the trauma of that first encounter. But another part of me, a part that was growing stronger every day, knew that this was real. Whatever had happened to me out there on that highway had changed me on a fundamental level. I wasn't just Jose the truck driver anymore. I was something more. It's been years now since that night on Highway 10, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I've never gone public with my story. Who would believe me? But I've continued to connect with others who've had similar experiences. We share our stories, our theories, our fears and hopes. Some of us have formed a kind of support group, meeting in secret to discuss our encounters and the changes we've gone through. We're careful, always watching for signs that we're being monitored or interfered with. Because one thing we all agree on is that this isn't over. Whatever these beings are, wherever they come from, they're still out there, and they're still interested in us. I don't know what their ultimate goal is, or why they chose me that night, but I do know that my life will never be the same. Every night as I lay in bed, I find myself looking out the window at the stars, wondering when they'll come back. Part of me is afraid, but another part is excited. Because I know now that we're not alone in the universe. And whatever's out there, whatever plans they have for us, it's bigger and more incredible than anything we could have imagined. So I wait, and I watch, and I wonder what will happen next. Third story, Desert Lights, Atacama Desert, Chile, 2005. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but I can't keep it bottled up anymore. It's been years since that night in the Atacama Desert, and I still can't make sense of what happened to me. I'm a truck driver, have been for over 2 decades now. I've driven through all kinds of terrain, in all kinds of weather, at all hours of the day and night, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced back in 2005. It was supposed to be a routine haul, just another long night drive through the desert. The Atacama's a strange place on its own, all that emptiness stretching out as far as the eye can see, like you're driving on the surface of Mars or something. But I was used to it, or at least I thought I was. The night started out normal enough. I had my thermos of coffee, some snacks, and my favorite radio station keeping me company. The stars were out in full force, lighting up the sky like I've never seen anywhere else. It's one of the things I've always loved about driving through the desert at night. You feel like you can see the entire universe laid out above you. I remember checking my watch around 11 p.m., calculating how long it would take me to reach my destination. That's when I first noticed something odd. There was this light in the sky, brighter than any star I'd ever seen. At first I thought it might be a planet, or maybe even a satellite. But as I kept driving, I realized it was moving. And not just moving, but getting closer. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a plane, or a helicopter. But it was moving way too fast for that. And the light. It wasn't like any aircraft lights I'd ever seen. It was this pulsing, bluish-white glow that seemed to shimmer and shift in a way that made my eyes hurt if I looked at it too long. I started to feel uneasy, like that primal part of your brain that tells you something's not right. But I kept driving, trying to focus on the road ahead and not whatever that thing in the sky was. That's when things started to get really weird. As the light got closer, my truck began to act up. The engine started to sputter and lose power, like it was running out of gas even though I knew the tank was full. Then the headlights flickered and went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, with only that eerie light from above illuminating the desert around me. I tried to restart the engine, turn the lights back on, but nothing worked. It was like every electrical system in the truck had just died. And that's when the fear really hit me. I was alone in the middle of the Atacama Desert in a dead truck with some unknown object hovering above me. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mouth went dry and I felt a cold sweat break out all over my body. I wanted to run, to hide, to do something, but I was frozen in place. It was like my body wasn't my own anymore. And then the light got so bright I had to close my eyes. I felt this strange sensation, like I was being lifted out of my seat. But it wasn't like normal movement. It was like gravity itself had changed direction. The last thing I remember is a high-pitched whine that seemed to come from inside my own head. And then nothing. When I came to, I was back in my truck, sitting in the driver's seat, like nothing had happened. But everything felt wrong. My body felt heavy and uncoordinated, like I was moving through syrup. My head was pounding, and there was this weird metallic taste in my mouth. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and that's when I noticed the time on the dashboard clock. It was showing 3:47 a.m. That couldn't be right. Last I remembered, it was just after 11 p.m. I'd lost nearly 5 hours. 5 hours that I had no memory of. I fumbled for my phone, thinking maybe the truck's clock was wrong, but my phone showed the same time. I felt panic rising in my chest. What had happened during those missing hours? Where had I been? The truck was running again, headlights illuminating the empty desert road ahead of me. But I didn't remember starting it back up. I looked at the odometer, and my blood ran cold. I traveled over 200 miles further than I should have been. How was that possible? I hadn't been driving, had I? As I sat there trying to make sense of what was happening, I became aware of a strange sensation on my skin. It felt tight and tingly, especially on my arms and hands. I rolled up my sleeves and what I saw made my stomach lurch. There were these weird marks all over my skin, perfectly circular bruises, each about the size of a quarter, arranged in symmetric patterns. They didn't hurt, but they definitely hadn't been there before. I touched one and it felt slightly raised like a welt. But the strangest thing was how uniform they were, how precisely spaced. It looked deliberate, like something or someone had methodically placed them there. I tried to remember if I'd felt anything, any pain or discomfort, but my mind was a complete blank. Just thinking about those missing hours made my head spin. I had to pull over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer. As soon as I stopped, I threw open the door and stumbled out into the cool desert night. The silence hit me first. It was so quiet I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The desert stretched out around me, endless and empty under the starry sky. I took deep breaths, trying to calm myself down, but the air felt different somehow. There was a faint ozone smell, like after a lightning strike, but the sky was clear. As I stood there, I became aware of a low, pulsing hum. At first, I thought it was just in my head, an after effect of whatever had happened. But as I focused on it, I realized it was coming from somewhere out in the desert. I squinted into the darkness, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A faint shimmer in the air, like heat waves, but it was the middle of the night and cold. I blinked, and it was gone. But the hum remained, barely audible but impossible to ignore once. I'd noticed it. I felt rooted to the spot, caught between the urge to investigate and the overwhelming desire to get back in my truck and drive as fast and as far as I could. My heart was racing again, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the chill in the air. Something had happened to me out here, something I couldn't explain or understand. And standing there in the dark, with that strange hum vibrating through my bones, I had the terrifying realization that whatever it was might not be over. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, before I finally managed to drag myself back into the truck. My legs felt like lead, and every movement was a struggle, as if my body was fighting against me. Once inside, I locked the doors and just sat there, staring out at the desert night. The hum had faded, or maybe I just couldn't hear it anymore, over the sound of my own ragged breathing. I knew I should start driving, get back on schedule, but I couldn't bring myself to turn the key. Instead, I found myself examining every inch of the cab, looking for, I don't know what. Evidence, clues, something to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint but distinctive, a sharp chemical odor that reminded me of hospitals and something else I couldn't quite place. It clung to my clothes, my skin, the fabric of the seats. I'd never smelled anything like it before, and it made my nose burn and my eyes water. I tried to open the windows to air it out, but the smell persisted, as if it had seeped into everything. As I sat there, trying to process everything, I became aware of a strange sensation in my head. It wasn't pain exactly, more like a pressure or a buzzing. And with it came flashes, quick, disjointed images that didn't make any sense. Bright lights, smooth, metallic surfaces, the sensation of floating, shadows moving in ways that shadows shouldn't move. Each flash lasted only a fraction of a second, but they left me feeling dizzy and disoriented. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, trying to make it stop, but the images kept coming. And with them came emotions, fear, confusion, and something else, a sense of awe or wonder that felt alien and uncomfortable. I tried to focus on these fragments, to piece them together into something coherent, but it was like trying to hold onto water. The more I reached for them, the more they slipped away, leaving me with nothing but a lingering sense of unease, and the certainty that something profound and terrifying had happened to me. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in this strange mental fog. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. When I finally looked up, I was startled to see the first hints of dawn on the horizon. The desert was coming alive with color, the sky shifting from inky black to deep purple to pale pink. It was beautiful, but it filled me with an inexplicable dread. I felt exposed, vulnerable in the growing light. Without really thinking about it, I started the truck and pulled back onto the road. I needed to move, to get away from this place. As I drove, I kept glancing in my rear-view mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching out behind me. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glint of something out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just the desert, vast and indifferent. I drove faster, pushing the truck to its limits as if I could outrun whatever had happened, whatever was still happening. But deep down, I knew it was futile. Whatever had touched me out there in the darkness, whatever had taken those missing hours, it wasn't something I could escape by simply driving away. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I began to feel a bit more like myself. The strange pressure in my head had subsided, and the flashes of alien imagery were becoming less frequent, but the marks on my arms remained. A constant reminder that what I'd experienced wasn't just some vivid nightmare. I found myself obsessively checking them, half expecting them to disappear or change, but they stayed stubbornly present, like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I tried to focus on the familiar routine of driving, checking my mirrors, monitoring my speed, watching the fuel gauge. But every so often, my eyes would be drawn to a spot on the horizon, or I'd catch a movement in the sky that would send my heart racing. The desert, which had always felt like a second home to me, now seemed alien and threatening. Every rock formation looked like it might be hiding something. Every shadow seemed to move in ways it shouldn't. I found myself longing for civilization, for the comforting presence of other people, other vehicles on the road. Anything to anchor me back to the world I knew. It was mid-morning when I finally reached the next town. I pulled into a truck stop, desperate for a break and some human contact. As I climbed down from the cab, my legs nearly gave out. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been, how tightly I'd been gripping the wheel. I staggered into the diner, aware of how I must look. Disheveled, wild-eyed, probably reeking of that strange chemical smell. The waitress gave me an odd look as I slumped into a booth, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I ordered coffee, black, hoping it would help clear my head. As I waited, I found myself eavesdropping on the conversations around me, hungry for any sense of normalcy. Truckers complaining about schedules, locals discussing the weather. It all sounded so mundane, so blessedly ordinary. But at the same time, it felt surreal, like I was watching a movie about normal life. How could everyone just go about their day when the world had shifted so profoundly? Didn't they feel it? The coffee arrived and I gulped it down, barely tasting it. I considered trying to talk to someone, to explain what had happened, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I possibly describe it? Who would believe me? I imagined the looks of disbelief, the awkward silence, the hasty excuses to leave. No, I realized, this was something I would have to deal with on my own. After forcing down some food I couldn't taste, I made my way to the restroom. I splashed water on my face, trying to wash away the night's events. But when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles underneath that made me look like I hadn't slept in days. My skin was pale, almost gray, and there was a haunted look in my eyes that I'd never seen before. But it was more than just physical exhaustion. There was something fundamentally changed about me, something in the way I held myself, in the wary, hunted look that I couldn't seem to shake. I rolled up my sleeves, examining the marks on my arms again. In the harsh fluorescent light, they looked even more unnatural. I traced one with my finger, and a shiver ran through me as I remembered the sensation of being lifted, of gravity shifting. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the mirror behind me, a dark shape just at the edge of my vision. I whirled around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just an empty bathroom. I leaned against the sink, trying to steady my breathing. Was this how it was going to be from now on? Jumping at shadows, seeing things that weren't there? The thought filled me with a deep, aching despair. I didn't know how to live like this, constantly on edge, questioning everything I saw and felt. But I also didn't know how to go back to the person I was before. That person was gone, lost somewhere in those missing hours in the Atacama Desert. I left the truck stop in a daze, barely aware of my surroundings as I climbed back into the cab. The familiar space now felt claustrophobic, tainted by memories I couldn't fully grasp. As I pulled back onto the highway, I found myself scanning the sky compulsively, searching for any sign of that strange light. The rational part of my brain knew it was pointless. Whatever had happened, it was over now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly finished, that somehow I was still connected to whatever it was. The desert stretched out before me, a vast expanse of sand and rock that seemed to go on forever. I'd always found it beautiful, even comforting in its stark simplicity. Now it felt oppressive, like it was hiding secrets just beyond my understanding. Every mile I drove felt like I was moving further from the world I knew, deeper into some twilight realm where the laws of reality no longer applied. I tried to focus on my destination, on the mundane details of my job, but my mind kept drifting back to those missing hours. What had happened to me? Why me? And most terrifyingly, would it happen again? As the day wore on, I began to notice other strange things. My sense of time seemed to be off, moments stretching out endlessly or snapping by in the blink of an eye. Colors looked wrong somehow, too vivid or slightly off hue. And there was a persistent ringing in my ears, barely noticeable most of the time, but occasionally rising to a painful pitch that made me wince. But the worst part was the growing sense of disconnect from my own body. It was subtle at first, a slight delay between deciding to move and actually moving, a feeling of weightlessness when I should have felt grounded. But as the hours passed, it got worse. There were moments when I felt like I was floating above myself, watching my hands on the steering wheel as if they belonged to someone else. Other times, I'd become hyper-aware of every sensation, the fabric of my shirt against my skin, the air moving in and out of my lungs, the beating of my heart. To the point where it became overwhelming, I found myself pulling over frequently, needing to ground myself, to reassure myself that I was still real, still here. As night began to fall, my anxiety ratcheted up to near unbearable levels. The darkness brought with it a sense of vulnerability that I'd never experienced before. Every star in the sky seemed to be watching me, judging me. The shadows at the edge of my headlights' reach seemed to move and shift, taking on impossible shapes. I knew I should find a place to stop for the night, but the thought of being stationary, of being an easy target, was terrifying. So I kept driving, pushing myself well beyond exhaustion, fueled by a mixture of fear and stubbornness. It was sometime after midnight when I saw it, a flash of light on the horizon, eerily similar to what I'd seen the night before. My heart leapt into my throat, and I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Terror, yes, but also a strange sense of anticipation, almost longing. Part of me wanted to floor it, to race away as fast as I could. But another part, a part I didn't, recognize or understand, wanted to stop, to wait, to welcome whatever was coming. I sat there, frozen in indecision, as the light grew brighter. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I blinked, wondering if I had imagined it, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. Whatever had happened to me in the Atacama Desert, whatever had taken those hours from me and left me changed, wasn't finished with me. And as I sat there in the dark, engine idling, I realized that a part of me didn't want it to be, because as terrifying as it was also the most profound thing I'd ever experienced. And despite everything, despite the fear and confusion and lingering sense of violation, I found myself hoping that someday, somehow, I'd understand what had really happened out there in the desert night.